We're back in session. We had a little glitch with our live streaming, so Jocelyn, we just want to go quickly over that first page, just hit the highlights, just in case it was missed the first go around. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to put up on the screen the staff report. Okay, so this afternoon, as we review the 2019 budget for Draft 2, we have already met a few times. We met in December and presented Draft 1, and at that time our budget tax rate increase was 5.71%. We met again through January, and this is the follow-up meeting from Draft 1 moving into Draft 2 with the changes that staff have proposed to try and bring the tax rate down from 5.71% to where we are today, which is 3.26%. We have addressed some of the questions that were raised at previous meetings, and those are referenced in the staff report. We did adjust some of the staffing hours and the cost for the beachfront programs, and that did make some reduction in staffing costs. We also adjusted staffing hours and costs for the enforcement program, and this adjustment is still ongoing. We used some of the federal gas tax funding for the arena rather than the loan financing. And we applied the ice resurfacing machine purchase to reserve funding as opposed to 50-50 reserve and taxation. We have changed the planning department structural alteration costs to draw from a reserve. And we've used some reserve funding for 50% of the cost of the new specialized transit bus. And adjusted some of the public works programs with better information that we had on timelines that helped reduce some of the taxation impact. So those are the changes that have been made from Draft 1 to Draft 2 that are reflected in bringing the tax rate decrease down to 3.26%. I was going to review next the questions that were in the staff report from the previous meetings. Before I do that, do you want me to stop for a moment?
Councillor Wells?
Yeah, if we're going to sort of do it in sections like that, just a couple of questions. One, the federal gas tax being used to impact or to be used to accommodate arena project. I guess I'm wondering how that impacts our transit funding, because generally the gas tax has been used towards the transit. So are we just assisting this project, but moving funding away from transit that we are going to need for transit, and then further down we're taking 50% of the transit bus. So I'm just kind of trying to follow the trail of this gas tax money being used in a way that I wasn't used to it being used.
So through your worship, federal gas tax funding we have generally used for the larger projects, the capital projects, as opposed to the transit bus that has generally been funded through the provincial gas tax.
Okay.
So that's the difference there on those two funds.
Okay. And the second question I had is the adjustments to the road projects, or to public works projects. The word here is adjustments. I guess I'm trying to understand what adjusted means. Are we simply moving the demand forward? In a sense, are we just kind of saying, well, okay, we won't need it this year, but now we're going to need more next year? Are we impacting the 2020 budget negatively by making those adjustments?
So I'll make a comment first, and then if you don't mind, I'll then ask Kevin to comment. But my understanding is the project, not as much of the project would happen in the 2019 year. It will defer over to 2020. And with that, Kevin, would you want to add anything?
Okay, yeah. So Moseley, so River Road West, for instance, that was, the reality is by the time we're through with utility conflict investigation, and we don't anticipate to get underway until the third quarter, like until late summer, not mid-year in terms of how we originally anticipated. So rather than starting the utility locates in the summer and doing 50% this year, 50% next, the reality is we're, given where we are now and where we project to be, we'll be doing probably a quarter this year and then 75% next year. So it's a 2-year utility relocate, and it's originally the estimates were kind of a 50-50 split, but we anticipate starting a little later, so it'll be 25-75.
I just want to be sure, Your Worship, that we're not finding the savings here, but next year when we have this discussion in October, November, all of a sudden it's going to come back to bite us because we didn't do it this year, but now all of a sudden we have this impact going forward into the next taxation year, that's all.
Thank you. Councillor Kenny?
Yeah, and to Councillor Wells' comments, I think as a prudent council, we actually should be wary to that fact, because all we got to do is look at our fire trucks. You know, that aspect. But to our Treasurer Jocelyn, you had mentioned the team has worked it down to 3.26 as a new area. How does, if we ended up staying at that, and I'm not going to guess on future, but how would that compare to what we looked at in 2018 as far as an increase in budget? Like, is it way above, or is it slightly above, or?
So I believe if I'm answering your question, the tax rate increase in 2018 was 2.66%.
Yeah, yeah, I rambled and you got it right.
Okay, I'll make sure I'm answering your question properly.
Yeah, no, thank you.
So that's and that is a reasonable adjustment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, we'll carry on.
Okay. So now we'll move into the part of the report that was talking about questions that were asked at previous meetings. And the first question was about the location of graphic design vendors that we were using. And in 2018, we had 3 vendors. One was from Wasaga Beach, one was from Sarnia, and one was from Acton. We also talked...
Okay, again, sorry, Jocelyn. And I think I was one of the ones that, or at least one of the ones that asked for that. And I guess I'm just going to simply state it again. I have no issue with the people from other communities. That's not my issue. I'm sure they do fine work, and I'm not in any way questioning that. But I guess I'm wondering, and I don't need a response, why we are using outside of town vendors if in fact the capabilities are here in town. And so I'm just going to put it out there that if there are graphic designers working in our town, paying our business taxes, paying our various things, that we should not be going outside the community unless it's absolutely necessary and there's no other alternative. It's just a point.
And I think that comes back to looking at our communications department and having everything filtered through one spot would, we could maybe address that at that time as well. So, Jocelyn.
Okay, and at our previous meeting, we did review the beachfront reports, and they are just attached for your reference. And a request was made for information about the funding of the downtown master plan. And so this little chart shows that $337,000 of funding was received from outside sources that was contributed towards the expenses for the downtown master plan. We also had a request for legal costs over the 2014-2018 period that would show the costs for projects and property. That report is still being worked on. It's quite extensive to prepare, as well as there was information requested more about the staff hirings over the past 4 years. And again, that report is also in the works and being prepared, so we'll be bringing both of those reports to the February 12th meeting. And a request was made for a revenue chart that supported the 5.71% tax rate increase. And what this chart shows is our total budget of $67 million here for the 2019 year. When we were at the 5.71%, we needed $24 million in taxation. And the rest of the revenue streams are listed here. And I had made a note that while there's $20 million coming from reserves and reserve funds, there is also $4 million going back into reserves and reserves funds through contributions during the 2019 year as well. On those questions, is there anything else?
Nope.
Okay. So then the report talks about some other considerations that are important for council to give further thought to. And the main one is the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund grant, or called the UMP Fund. And this grant started in 2018, decreasing by 15% per year, and that we received notification from the province that that would continue until the grant was gone. And in the past, the town has used about $2.2 million of the UMP grant has been used to contribute to the capital replacement reserve. As well, we've had about $200,000 as a 1% capital levy also going to the capital asset replacement reserve. And this $2.2 million was coming from the asset management plan that was approved in 2016. It doesn't address the full shortfall of what's needed to meet the asset management plan, but it was a reasonable contribution to start in that direction. And so in order to continue building that capital asset plan, it is important that we look at possibly consider increasing taxation revenue to offset this loss, so that as well this grant was contributing to supporting operations. So as that grant continues to go down, we have less and less towards our operations support as well. So those are two needs for where we might need to increase our tax rate to help support those revenues that are disappearing. The other consideration too in this regard is that the province right now is reviewing this grant, and they have only committed to the first quarter of the 2019 year to provide funding. If that was to majorly change, we would have a significant issue that we would be needing to address from the capital asset replacement standpoint. The total decrease for 2019 in the grant is $375,000. So that amount reflects about $281,000 less to the capital replacement reserve and about $94,000 less for operations. Is there any questions about the UMP grant?
Councillor Commite?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just at the recent conference, and I understand this is under review, but certainly the general sense that was repeated on more than one occasion was communities that are in a good position of reserve are potentially going to have UMP fund reduced. And so again, how long that decision takes, whether that would happen this year, but proactively we may want to have some communication with the provincial government related to that point, because when you have been financially responsible and have increased your reserves, to be penalized with UMP fund or grants is somewhat reinforcing behavior you don't want repeated. So.
Any other comments? That's it. Okay. The next section of the report deals with municipal comparators. And using the 5.71% tax rate increase, I have used that here for the Wasaga Beach line. And the other municipalities that are similar in the urbanization of their towns, as Seg Beach is, they are shown at their 2018 tax rates. So even using our 2019, their 2018, you can see that we are third from the bottom of the list. And we have generally been second or third from the bottom over the past few years. Our tax rate increases have been relatively low. And it demonstrates that relative to other similar urban cities, that the town has a very low rate. And over time, that continuous approach strategy to a low tax rate will have an impact on the town's sustainability, or it could have, if other sources of revenue aren't available to help offset the needs of a growing town. And I just thought it was important that we understand where our tax rate is relative to our community and other towns that are providing similar type services. Were there any questions about this chart?
Councillor Belanger?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to also point out that in the last census information, we also had a average family income that was 18% below the provincial average, which I think is important to note.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just making a note. So that concludes what was in the report with regards to information. And then we listed our next steps, which is the February 12th meeting, where we would bring forward any remaining staff reports that have been requested, and any adjustments to the budget that come out of today's meeting that are requested. And then at the February 12th meeting, we'll present that third draft of the budget and seek council's permission to advertise for the public meeting, which in the budget schedule is currently planned for March 19th. So with that, I thought perhaps I would just turn it back to council for discussion.
Okay, and is there any comments, questions for Jocelyn? Councillor Wells?
Yeah, and I appreciate what Treasurer said to us about our comparators with other communities. I'm not so sure, Jocelyn, that is an issue that therefore warrants our jumping a higher tax rate, only because we've been in that position for a long time, so we're just continuing the same position within the framework. So, you know, to suddenly say, oh, well, we need to do that, I'm struggling with that one. I'm going back to the chart you had about the tax rate and as to reserves and whatever. I'm not sure that I can provide an answer or a solution. That's the sad part, is that in looking at the funding coming, some $44 million, I think it was roughly in the chart. If you're simply looking at reserves and tax, the top of the chart right there. No, yeah, that's it, sorry, 24, 20, 44. I mean, I just did a very rough, quick calculation, but even allowing for the $4 million going back in, that makes the reserve and reserve fund net as about 16 mil. That means that we are taking roughly 36% of our needs out of reserves. And I'm just not sure that's sustainable over the long term. And I guess I'm wondering how we can start to tighten our belts maybe, and maybe some of our wishes and our desires, maybe there's a difference between wants and needs that we're going to have to address in order to find a common ground in the middle. But again, I'm not sure that 36% of our budget coming out of reserve is a sustainable, long-term sustainable possibility. So it's not a criticism by any stretch. You're only working with the numbers you got, and I fully appreciate that. It does make me a little nervous.
If I could just respond on 2 points. The first one I would say on the reserves is one thing we need to remember, that the major portion of this draw from reserve is from the reserve funds, which is what the reserves funds are purposed for. We put the development charges away, and when we need to make those capital expenditures, we're expected to draw on those reserves. So I think that it would be a little bit different from drawing and supporting the budget fully on your general reserves. The second item that I would like to respond to is in regards to the this chart. I wouldn't suggest that we are increasing the tax rate because of where we're sitting. Rather, I would use the chart to help support the understanding that continuous long-term low tax rates do impact long-term sustainability of the town going forward. And that really is just supporting that comment as opposed to being the catalyst for why you would change.
Yeah, and I fully accept and I totally agree with you. I think if we go back a few years, there were a couple of years where the tax rate increase was incredibly low, and I think now we're seeing the fallout from those decisions. And so I totally understand. I totally agree that we have been placed in a position where we can't continue to do that without having a sort of a heavier hit.
Okay, Councillor Boulanger?
Thank you, Your Worship. To our treasurer, just a clarification, if I'm understanding this correctly, is the money coming out of reserves is not to support operations, support capital expenditures. And again, at the recent conference, I think the message was very clear that towns that are in a good position of reserve are less apt to get grants. So the capital expenditures that we will require going forward may more and more rely on our current reserve funds. And as to the percentage, I believe if we look back over the last 10 years, depending on what projects were underway, we often had a heavy draw on reserves, and then we'd have a number of years where we would be able to recover those reserves, and then again there would be those years where the draw was much higher just based on the number of projects that were undertaken, if I'm correct.
Yes, it would vary from year to year depending on the projects. The reserves for the 2019 budget are being used, general reserves are being used for operations, but they're also just the reserve funds are being used. So out of 20 million approximately in utilization in the budget, about 14 million is coming from the reserve funds, which is the capital projects, and about 7 million is coming from the operations side, of which 2 million of that is coming from the capital replacement reserve, because we've used that a lot more extensively in 2019. So our past practice is generally 50% taxation, 50% reserves for our fleet replacements and things of that nature. We've leaned more on the reserve in 2019. So the total capital replacement draw is 2 million of that 7 million for operations. Just to give you some general numbers.
Deputy Mayor Bray?
Thank you. One thing I took from the conference was that there was a real expectation that municipalities worked on their capital asset plan, so that we are building for the future, and we know that there are dollars in there. So I don't remember hearing that if you have reserves you won't get grants, but I certainly do remember a very strong message that we need to work on our capital asset plan, and we need to start funding it, and we need to you know, we have always done that, so I think we've been a very responsible municipality, but I don't remember hearing that we would be penalized for our responsibility.
Councillor Kinney?
Thank you.
No, I was looking at the numbers, what we're down to a 3.26 from 2.6, which is about a 0.66 increase on your rate. And if 1%, and please correct me because I'm not the treasurer, is 228,000. If you run that out, we're looking at adding an additional $148 $149,000 to the budget from last year. Keeping in mind that we've all been, when we are canvassing, we're all supporting big capital expenditures like an arena, a library, a fire truck. So somewhere down the line, we have to make that happen, and I don't really see where we're sitting right now an unexpected or unreasonable or unresponsible move forward for a budget at that rate.
I'm thinking Jocelyn's not going to disagree with you.
Maurice?
Councillor Boulanger?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Just in clarification, in the discussion at the conference related to the fund, the comment was that under the review, the thought was that the greatest portion of the fund would go to communities that are in the greatest need, is how it was depicted.
Any other questions? Councillor Watson?
Thank you, Your Worship. On the decision chart, item number 36, which is the Mosley Street urbanization, in the immediate future, if an entity decided to locate in the west end of Wasaga, would that urbanization have to be accelerated? And would there, I guess, I don't know if there's a Kevin question or not, but would that have to be accelerated, that project, to provide infrastructure in that regard?
Kevin?
Sorry, I was.
Were you not paying attention?
Number 36 on the big chart, it was dealing with the Mosley Street urbanization, 45th Street to Beechwood Road. So the question was, if the West End started to develop, would we need to get this going quicker, or not a big deal?
So we just finished the environmental assessment for this, and the reason why we try and advance at least the EAs and the designs consistent with our 10-year capital plan is to position us for future funding, and to have those shovel-ready projects, because we know once we get the design done, there's significant utility relocates that take a couple of years to initiate. But the reason for advancing this particular project was really to have the design finalized, because we know we want to improve the pedestrian crossing opportunities for signalized crossings at 51st Street and 62nd Street, because that was the outcome of the EA, was to enhance those intersections with signalized crossings. And so the intent was to advance the design, the full limits of the design, so we know we can expedite at least the signalized intersections before we do the full project. And the full design would allow us to at least get underway with the signals, recognizing that we still have River Road West improvements to extend, and that is still staff's priority to get past the school and River Road West and get to Blueberry Trails before we focus on Mosley. So the intent of this design was really to position us so we can advance the signalized improvements within a shorter term. Does that answer your question somewhat in a long
This road does
way?
not have to be done before further development in the West End, I believe is what.
No, obviously from staff's perspective, we'd like to have drainage facilities and sidewalks and cycling infrastructure throughout town. But you know, from a capacity standpoint, the 2 lanes, they're not exceeding capacity, but again, there are still some challenges with drainage and pedestrians and cycling of that nature. So the condition of the road is fair from a rideability standpoint, but the reason for advancing the design was really to position us to do the signalized intersections ahead of the full road reconstruction, because we know it'll take certainly a lot of funding to advance that in the future.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? George?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to cycle back a bit just to talk a little bit about the fund and the grant for a second, if we could. So we can see that the amount of grant is being reduced over a period of time, and the impact on 2019 is equivalent to 1.6% of our tax rate. So we're having to absorb that into our operations, and about $375,000 we've had to absorb into that. So that's about half your tax rate increase. So if you look at 3.25 right now, 1.6 is half of that. If we go down to the municipal comparators for a second, there's a number of municipalities on that list that either get no UMF grant right now or very little UMF grant because of their situation. And we talked about some of the factors that are taken into account. And one of the factors is your residential commercial tax rate split. So, you know, we're heavily predominantly residential, and there's a little bit commercial, but we're now of a size, you know, 21,000, we're continuing to grow, and our financial situation is good. So that's why we're seeing this gradual reduction. But some of these municipalities have never received an UMF grant. So when you look at us, where we are, you know, and as that UMF grant declines over time, you know, we're going to be challenged as a municipality in terms of making up that funding. You know, people ask me, you know, what keeps you up at night? You know, the thing that concerns me is the government saying the UMF grant is gone tomorrow. You know, because that equates to about an 8% tax rate increase. Now, council in the past made a wise decision to put those funds into the capital plan in terms of its asset management. So certainly it won't impact the operations to a great extent. However, as we've heard around the table, it will impact our capital asset plan. So at some point, the municipality is going to need to look at that in terms of dealing with that, because that's certainly a possibility. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it is a concern of mine because the government has indicated it's looking at all aspects of its financial situation. It is in a deficit situation, and the government has sent out signals that it's looking at everything. And as Councillor Belanger said, you know, if you're financially healthy, that'll be a factor to determine. So I just wanted to mention that because it is something that, you know, as we move forward through this, and it's somewhat, as I mentioned to the mayor earlier, you know, it's somewhat of a message that gets lost in the discussion about the decline of that grant and how the municipalities had to make that up, and hopefully going forward, you know, we'll be able to emphasize that point to try to explain to the residents what we're doing as a municipality to address this through our budget process. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Councillor Watson?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, George sort of stole my thunder. I was going to ask.
Steal your words?
I was going to ask that question. Where's the definition of that? Because I know Collingwood is an example. They get no lump funding, I believe, and I'm not sure who else on that list does or doesn't. But I just didn't know where the dividing line was, where they say you've now reached a threshold of somewhere where you're not eligible anymore for it. Because there has to be something. Because I know some don't get it.
George?
A few years ago, and our previous treasurer tried to find out what the criteria was to determine, you know, who got the UMP fund and then how much municipalities got, and she was able to put some pieces of it together, but we never really did get a definitive answer in terms of why some municipalities were eligible, some weren't, why some received a substantial amount, why some got a smaller amount. So it was just there was some science to it, but we were never able to get a definitive answer. But as I said, when the government's looking at everything now, that's where, you know, everybody might be on a common plane going forward.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else for Jocelyn? Okay. Do you have what you need from us today? Or do you have more to go through?
I don't have more to go through. I don't need anything else.
You were expecting to go away with a list, right?
Yeah.
To change.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm quite comfortable if you want me to go away now.
I don't know. The deputy mayor's got her hand up here, so.
Well, I thought we were going to be working through the spreadsheet today, just kind of.
Well, and I think that's what staff did kind of already, is what you were saying, right?
We have, and we've gone through that, and so I'm prepared if you would like to do that, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to go through that, given that staff have already spent 2 meetings going through it.
So maybe if there's just specific questions on this, if somebody has them, would that work for what you want to do?
Sure.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Sure, I could start. There was a number of new positions included, and I would like to propose that instead of new positions in the org chart at this point, is that we maybe have some sort of an HR review that looks at the whole organization and determines, you know, do we need 2 new economic development positions? Do we need, there was a number of other ones as I was working my way through that I kind of went, oh, HR, and I don't know that I'm comfortable making that decision as part of the budget. I think it needs to be reviewed in more detail.
And I'm gonna pass it over to George, because I know we've had that discussion about getting that back to the table.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so that's a very good point. We had a discussion around the senior leadership team as well in terms of bringing forward, as part of what we had talked about, Councillor Wells had raised with respect to the hires from 2014 to 2018, is looking at justification for the new positions and providing that to council so that you have that information. As we know around the table, when you propose a position, that position gets hired, that's typically part of your, part embedded in your costs. So we have to review those very, very carefully. So that was part of our plan to bring that forward. So
That's coming on the 12th though.
correct.
Okay. All right, did you have any more questions? On anything
I
else?
don't, that's it for now. I'll keep going and see if I have more questions.
Okay, Councillor Blanchet?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. A question through to our CAO. My understanding is that our current debt ratio to what is considered, the provincial standard is in a very good position. And I guess my question is there another revenue stream that we should be looking at? I've had some conversations with our treasurer, and money is at an all-time low as far as borrowing. And my understanding is if we look at the 2-year history of our one fund, at the end of November it was generating an annual return of 11.5%. At the end of November it was still 8.5% even after the market correction, which has come back quite a bit. So I would say today we're probably in the 10% range. We can borrow money at 3%. And I just believe there may be an opportunity or a strategy there where we should increase our debt at a very low lending rate and invest more money into our one fund. Now, the treasurer's indicated to me that we do have investment policy, but this council could certainly choose to invest a little more in the one fund. And I think historically, even through the crash of 2008, that fund has been generating over, I think 6.8% over 5 years, but it's been an unbelievably successful fund over a very long period of time.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, and so you're correct. The one fund has performed very, very well, and several years ago, an investment strategy was brought forward where we put a certain amount of the town's funds in the one fund. The treasurer could probably elaborate further, and certainly we could relook at that policy. We have not had that conversation about borrowing money and then investing it. We have not had that conversation around this table, but certainly we looked at investing some of the long-term funds that the town has in reserve into the one fund to take advantage of those high interest rates. So I don't know if the treasurer wants to elaborate a little bit further, but that's something certainly from an investment approach or investment strategy, council could revisit if it wanted to.
So presently we do have $5 million in the equity one fund, earning the rate, I guess the annualized return, if you were in the beginning of that fund, the annualized return right now is 6.45%. That account is earning as of December 31st. So yes, we can move some of our other investments into that fund, but they're really most of our reserves that we have and cash that we have it invested. It's just a matter of transferring it possibly out of the bond portfolio and into the equity investment.
Councillor Blanchet?
Yeah, thank you. Through the mayor and CEO and treasurer, certainly our mayor has talked about the possibility of the redevelopment of Beach One, where we own a lot of property. I don't know what that would command, but we know it's on the books at $13.8 million. So if we were to sell that property and get anywhere in the neighborhood of $13.8 million or $15 million or whatever it is, half of that loan is locked in for 25 years, just over 3%. And the other 50% of that loan is a variable at a very low interest rate, again, about 3%. I don't think I have to tell anybody that $15 million invested at the range of 10% versus 3% would give us $700,000 a year compounded over 20 years. I believe the math works out to in excess of $20 million. And you still would have your initial principal intact. So this strategy and what we're planning in the future could be significant to the health of our community.
And I think that when we get to a point of looking at a business plan for the beachfront and whatever council decides to do, if we have a pot of money, then I think that discussion happens at that point. I don't think it's something that we can predict now to change a policy for something that might not work. George?
Thank you, and I think that's, to your point, it's the investment strategy once you have those proceeds. And the council does have options in terms of how it wants to invest those proceeds and to look for the maximum benefit to the taxpayer, not only for today, but for the foreseeable future, and by that is 10 to 20 years down the line. So those are important decisions, Your Worship.
Yeah, I see that as a discussion down the road, but we're just not quite there. Anybody else have questions or comments? Councillor Wells?
Well, I guess I'm just wondering if we're not offering the treasurer any further advice. Then it would strike me that we are, by default, accepting a 3-point-something% increase. That's kind of, I read it because we're not asking her to make any other adjustments.
I think the only thing is that we are getting a report on the staffing and things, so I don't know if that would make
I realize that
big enough.
I realize that may make some difference.
Yeah.
But I'm just pointing out we are as of 3:40 today. By not offering or asking for any other, we have accepted 3-point-whatever%.
Well, I don't know that we have because we've got on the 12th still.
Yeah,
So
I appreciate exactly what you're saying,
Yeah.
Your Worship, that, there could be changes after that, but as of 3:40 today, we have not offered the treasurer any other opportunity to make an adjustment. So draft 2 goes forward as 3-point-whatever.
Yeah.
And draft 3 may be then affected by
the things that we
the
discussed
things
on the
that
12th.
happen in the next term around.
Anyone? Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Councillor
that's okay. Thank you, through your worship. I mentioned to someone earlier, as we go through a lot of the capital expenditures, the expertise of any one member of council, I think we rely pretty heavily on our Director of Public Works. So, as I looked at some of them, you wonder if anything, could be postponed, but that, to your points, Councillor Wells, it could be just delaying and creating more of a problem later. But I just found that it was pretty challenging on quite a bit of this report to, with any level of expertise, make a determination of whether or not there was a savings, and I would certainly rely on Kevin Lalonde's expertise if there's any further savings in some of those projects. So.
Okay. Moved by Councillor Wells, seconded by Councillor Belanger. Be it resolved that Committee of the Whole, its Budget Committee, received the information related to Council's inquiries from the 2019 Draft 1 Budget for information, and further that Council provide direction to staff regarding changes to be made to Draft 2 of the 2019 budget. Final chance.
Roll call for the vote. Councillor Belanger?
In favor?
Deputy Mayor Bright? In favor. Councillor Kinney?
In favor.
Councillor Watson?
In favor?
Councillor Wells?
In favor?
Mayor Baffochi?
In favor.
Vote is 6 in favor and 0 opposed. Motion carries.
Unfinished business, we have none. New business. Okay. Items for future meetings, we have none. Closed session, we have none. Reports from closed session, none. So we are adjourned. Thank you.